Good morning, everyone. Hope your first few days of school have gone well. I've seen some of you already interacting in the discussion board, and I'm always happy to see that. I think that's a really important part, especially up front, that we get a chance to introduce ourselves to one another since we don't have any human contact at all. Um, this morning, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about, I guess, the precursors of the course. Talk about, and try to work through the historical timeline of children's literature, and really kind of describe to you what children's literature really is. I also want to talk a little bit about Aesop's and some of the Bible stories that are in the week one folder. Um, I'll slow down on the videos here in a few weeks. I just want to make sure that you get a really solid foundation going into this, because if we miss some of these things up front, we possibly may not read the literature for its whole value. So we don't want to miss anything. So this morning, I kind of want to start out talking about kind of from a historical perspective, when does children's literature really begin? And I'm one that I'm really not convinced that true children's literature can really begin before maybe the mid 19th century, 1850s, 1860s, if even then. Because we have to think about when and how and to what extent, children's literature is really marketed to and for children. So, I mean, early on, we have lots of stories throughout history: King Arthur, Robin Hood, those kinds of stories, and even Aesop's fables, as you've read some of those in the folder. Many times we attribute them to children's literature, but it's a really hard. I guess it's a hard case to prove um, as far as it being written for children. So, I mean, really, in my opinion, I mean, even up through the mid 19th century with Mark Twain and stories like Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn and those kinds of things, we still see them now as children's literature, but that was never Twain's intention. His intention was to, kind of challenge the social injustice, and he was a satirist. So, in other words, he's trying to make fun of the world so it will draw our attention to a certain problem. And I think that's exactly the way that some of these very early ancient stories kind of play out in history. So, um, but for myself, I'm kind of believe that the 20th century, and that's just me, um, believing that that's when children's literature really takes off. Although we do have a few people in the 1850s, 1860s that are trying to work towards it, as well as Locke and Rousseau in the 18th century, the philosophers who see value in raising our children and educating our children a certain way. I still don't think until we really come to the Dick and Jane books that we really have much in the way of what is really truly marketed entirely for children. And I come to this conclusion, I guess mostly because, and I think even today, that the value of children is not necessarily perceived the way that it should be. Children throughout time have just been incidental to marriage, incidental to some sexual act. And I don't know that all children are valued by those who have created them or procreated them, whichever way you want to look at it, to the extent that they should be. So the value in children in the 20th century, I think, really jumps up. And now, and I mean, this is part of it with you taking this class and interested in going into education, the value in children is increasing. So I want to talk just a little bit about the history. Um, Really, the earliest forms of literature, um, I guess, really begin with the Epic of Gilgamesh, and some of you may have been exposed to that in another literature class. It's about the 18th century BCE, or before the Common Era, or for those of us who are a little older, remember it as BC, before Christ. So 18 centuries back beyond that. So if we're in the 21st century, that's a pretty old piece of literature. and it's not even entirely complete, and it was found on cuneiform. So that means it's on a cylinder, on a disc, and it's not written in a modern language like we understand English or Spanish or something like that, but written with symbols. So that's really our earliest piece of literature. Now, we don't have authorship, but we use those types of epics to share with our children, to teach certain lessons. Well, the timeline, it just continues to move. And then we get to somewhere around the 2nd century BCE when Judaism is on the rise. And in Judaism, that's where this real tradition really begins of literature that involves some hierarchical or some expected behavioral, social type conditions that we're orally passing down. It's not going to be for several centuries before we start to record even any of those stories. So the storytelling begins, definitely, even possibly before, Gilgamesh, but it really has its heyday with Jewish literature, and then later that'll move on into the Christian literature, as you've seen in the week 1 folder. So we move along, and in the 1400s, okay, the 13th century, that's when we start to see literature that maybe is not marketed towards children, but it is directed towards children. And those are behavior type things. It's really the first time that our children are truly, truly inculcated in behavior. I mean, there are really 2 principles that are trying to be taught to children at this point with behavior literature and right behavior. The first principle is that there is some hierarchical system, that there are those that are in charge or sovereign and those who are not. It's almost a haves and have-nots thing. It's some order that the world has assumed is very, very natural. Monarchies and all that always worked through the centuries feeling like they were divinely inspired. There's also this, I guess, ethical issue that we're trying to inculcate our children in at this time, and that's also a discussion on the haves and have-nots, because it's about disproportion over equality, which we see most of the time in Aesop's work, which he is really dealing with. Around the 1500s, there is a neat little book that becomes public. They call them chapbooks. Now, it wouldn't have been available to every child in the world, or even most children like books are today, only really available to the elite. And these chapbooks, which is just kind of slang for chapter books, they weren't necessarily the chapter books that we understand now, where they're just longer and deeper and the concepts and themes are wider. Chapter books were like a conglomeration of different things. There would have been some poetry. There would have been like some art type projects, mostly outdoor stuff for boys and things like that. Once again, not really targeted towards children necessarily, and especially girls. Girls would not have been privy to that unless they were extremely privileged at that time. We get into the 1600s, we're starting to see some religious literature kind of come onto the scene from the Protestant side. This is, the time of the Reformation. And one that really comes to mind is John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. He wrote this while he was imprisoned for his beliefs. While he is there, he creates this story. It's really fantastical. If you've never read it, it's really great. It's about the protagonist. His name is Christian, and he is married and has children, but he has this dream, and he goes on this journey to find the Crystal City. So the Crystal City is very emblematic of heaven, and Christian, with the struggles that he goes through throughout the entire story, it's very symbolic of a Christian's life. The struggles that they have, the things that they encounter along the way. So we also see another work called not Pilgrim's Progress, but Piers Plowman that comes around just before that, which our protagonist, we never know who it is, but it's the Dreamer. Now, the Dreamer is the same kind of a story. It's a guy that every time he sits down, he dozes off and he starts thinking about something religious. Now, the whole point here is not that these things exist or that we should all just run out and buy a copy, but the whole point here is that many of these works, depending on where our young children are being educated, they are almost considered to be children's works when their original writers had never intended them for children. So, moving into the 1700s, that's when Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe comes up, which was one of my favorites, although I didn't read it until I was an adult. Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. If you've not read these things, they're very fantastical. They're really kind of cool because Robinson Crusoe is very much the adventure book. Gulliver's Travels is your original fantasy. And I think it even today, we've kind of lost its flair because Harry Potter has come in and J.K. Rowling has changed some things around. But Gulliver's Travels, even if you explore that, is every much as bit as exciting as Harry Potter or any in that particular series. So once again, these are not necessarily written to children, but they're just great literature that kind of works its way down to children, okay? As they are becoming more educated, they're still incidental. We still don't have laws yet anywhere in the world to protect children or ensure that they go to school. That's not going to happen until we move into the 1800s. And that actually begins in Great Britain. And as a result of poets like William Blake and his poems like The Chimney Sweeper, about the little boy who has a dream. And his dream is that if I'm just a good little boy, I'm going to at least get to go to heaven, even though my life just completely sucks right here while I'm on earth. And then he does another poem entitled the same thing, but it's almost an extension of this when the little boy comes into reality, that he realizes that he's going to die and nobody did care about him because his mother had passed away and his father sold him into service. So it's during this time frame that children are starting to at least have societal value, where certain people in society, mostly poets, which is kind of odd, see that children need to have a special life and need to be handled a certain way instead of working, 20 hours a day in a factory and sleeping in an alley somewhere. So when these laws come out, at the same time, there are requirements for them to go to school. So at that point, if there's no children's literature, if there are no children's textbooks, you have to use existing things. And the things that just felt most appropriate would have been works like Robinson Crusoe. And additionally, there are many people who learned to read in the 19th century, even in the early 20th century, that learned to read from a Bible. And I know that sounds kind of odd in the 21st century, but that was their reading primer. So if we look at it realistically, children's literature really doesn't take hold as an entity by itself until much later. We roll into the 1900s. That's when we're starting to produce textbooks and primers for children to use in the classroom. Cartoons really start to climb onto the scene. And Disney, takes things to a whole nother level. Warner Brothers, really begin to market these things. And although everybody likes them, they are mostly marketed to children at this point. And the content in our works are really beginning to mature. I remember maybe the things that I was exposed to, the content may not have been nearly as mature as some of the things that you were exposed to as a child. So as content really begins to mature, there are lots and lots of things for those of us as educators or as parents that we really, really need to consider. So, I mean, that's the down and dirty and quick on the historical timeline as far as children's literature is concerned, but that doesn't really answer the question about what is children's literature. Now, we know it isn't anything old, and I do believe it is fairly new, but new doesn't mean yesterday. New can mean the last couple hundred years when you're looking at the grand scope of things from the 18th century BCE till now. But children's literature, I guess the way that I would define it, I would say that it's like stories and books, poetry, or any other media, because we do live in a world today where our children are bombarded with all kinds of things that don't necessarily come out of a book. So children's literature, stories, books, poetry, or any other media that is enjoyed by children. Now, that doesn't mean that those of us who are older don't enjoy it. Um, Many of you are going to enjoy some of the things that we read. There were a couple of books actually on the book list for the class that until I started teaching this course, I had never read. But they were popular reads, so I thought, well, I'll give them a chance. So I read them, and I was like amazed. And there's one of them, The Bridge to Terabithia. I can't believe that I had never read it. Wonderful book, but I read it at 50 years old for the first time. So even though they're all enjoyed by children, that doesn't mean that the rest of us can't. And it also doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with us reading a book that's marketed to children. I mean, many of us really, really enjoy Harry Potter for various reasons. Maybe it's because we would like to live in an alternate world, although Harry Potter's world is not really any better than ours. But we do like the fact that J.K. Rowling goes in there and challenges the social system in things. So, but stories, books, poetry, any media that's enjoyed by children. Now, in a contemporary sense, just like any other literature and its markets, we are going to separate them by genre. And any genre really that we have for adults, we typically have something kind of sort of like it. Now, not all of them. Now, one that comes to mind as we're talking is a fairly new genre. And it's really come about over probably the last 5 or 6 years. And it can be very controversial. But it is, the LBGT, and there are several others that go with the acronym now, that type of literature, even being marketed to children. For my class over here at the junior college, I like to do a banned book project where we take the top 10 banned books in America for the last year, and the student has to pick one and read them. Some of them we find are very, very mainstream type books that deal with this issue. And in the world we live in, there are plenty of people who believe that maybe children can make those decisions at a certain age. I don't know. We all have our opinion on it, but still, we are seeing that as a genre. We also contemporarily, we separate them by age. What is appropriate for them to read? And it's for a couple of different reasons. The first reason is the simplicity. A picture book is important because the pictures, along with the text, help tell the story. They help the student to relate the text so that they can understand what they're reading. Very short, very sweet, very simple. But even our picture books have the same components as any story does. So the other reason is the maturity of content. It wouldn't be appropriate because we do have those children that are 7 or 8 could read something that somebody in high school could read. But is it appropriate at this point to introduce a child to some of these more complex things of the world? So those things are considerations in a contemporary sense as far as children's literature is concerned. Now, children's literature can be, like I said, just run the gamut of genres. It can be fiction, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Really wonderful story by C.S. Lewis, and there's also a series with those. But it can be nonfiction as well, something like The Diary of Anne Frank. Something that actually really happened. Diary of Anne Frank, it is historical fiction as well as Holocaust fiction, and it's just considered straight nonfiction. So, still fits in to children's literature. We can have things that are allegorical. So, in other words, they are representative of things that are happening in the world. And like I said a few moments ago, and this is the thing I love about Rowling and her work, is the fact that she's dealing with the tough social issues, and she's doing it in such a way that as children read these things, they are aware that there's an ugly world around them. And I think that that makes perfect sense, especially for those of us who live like in this part of Texas. We tend to live a very provincial life. We don't think about things outside of here. And so if our children are reading that, they understand that the world that's around them maybe not be the same as the world that's a little farther out around them. They can be illusion. In other words, we're reading a story, but it alludes to something greater. Now, we see this especially in Christian literature or any kind of religious literature, the Indian epic Ramayana. It takes us, even though we're hearing the story or reading the story, it's sending our mind to something with a higher principle. We're reading the story, but we're thinking about something else. So it can be any of those things. It can be anything that you can imagine. We're marketing those things to our children. But that answers, that begs the question, is children's literature really all that special? Well, my answer is no, it's not. Because it has a historical sense. Children have always been incidental, as I said before. And I think that, many times literature through the centuries is all about gathering an audience, getting people to stop and listen to you. And the reason for that, I think, is so that our authors or even the oral storytellers are wanting to expose their audiences to something much greater. But we'll talk about that in just a minute. Excuse me. Now, no, it may not be special in some sense, but in another sense, maybe a more contemporary sense, that it is special. And we have to consider, when a child's education really begins. Does it begin when they start to learn the 3 R's, the reading, writing, arithmetic? No, not necessarily. It really begins when children are exposed or starting to be indoctrinated into moral codes, into societal norms, to justice, to ethics, to religious principles. That's when their education really, really begins. And that's what children's literature does. It exposes them to societal incongruences. Okay? Especially with Aesop, as we'll see in a few minutes. Aesop really comes and draws the disparities out, the issues with society, the wrongs, the injustices. Well, literature is a very safe place to do that for children. You would much rather a child read about it than to have to experience it themselves. It also brings up some political issues with race, issues with class, issues with gender, and those gender roles. And in the 21st century, we're challenging those traditional gender roles, but literature will bring those things out in a well safer manner. Is children's literature important? Absolutely. Yes, from a historical or a contemporary context. Historically, children's literature is important because literature typically is a narrative form. It's not choppy. It's not like this lecture here where you're bored to death. You've stopped it 3 times to go get something to drink. But if they're reading in a narrative, we tell one straight story because that's the way we think. We want the straight story. Now, although we don't necessarily always have the whole story, and that's not even always possible, but we think in blocks. We store up this information, but that doesn't do us any good. We want the whole story. So we take the new information, add it to the old information, and it becomes very much a straight line for storytelling. So historically, and its historical value from what children can learn, they can even see the progress of morality, the progress of religion, the progress of society just through the narrative of literature. Now, it can also be a primer for moral and right behavior and ethical behavior. What is the right thing to do based on some moral standard or based on some societal agreement? And I like to explain the two because they are not the same. Morals come from teaching, things that we are taught. Many of us that live in the Western world, we were brought up on some type of religious principle. Don't kill, don't lie, don't cheat. Don't want something that's not yours. That's a moral standard that is taught to us, and that's something that's passed down from family to family or whatever environment that you're in. Excuse me. Then there's the ethics that have really not everything to do, but mildly only moral. But they are things that we agree on are the right thing to do. It's like the stoplight at the end of the street. We have agreed by our laws that the safe thing to do is to stop when the light is red. Because if we don't stop when the light is red, if we keep running through it, we're going to run right out into the street and our lives are going to be taken. Okay, so that's something that we've agreed upon. We've also agreed upon that children should go to school because it's in their best interest and we want a society that's educated and intellectual and can solve problems. So that's an agreement we made. That really doesn't come out of any moral standard. The only moral standard that we really have is that, yeah, we should teach our kids to love God and those kinds of things. But ethically, there's something more, and we agree on those as a society. So they become definitely a primer for this thing that we call tension and conflict in the world. Tension and conflict is what moves every story along in literature. Tension and conflict is what moves our lives along. And we'll talk a little bit more about this next week when we discuss the fairy tales. But it is definitely an introduction to tension and conflict in the world. It may be the absolute first time that they get to see it. But once again, it's an introduction that is happening in a very safe place. Maybe it's at home with a parent. Maybe it's in a classroom. But it's going to be removed from probably the greater of the problems of the world as they're exploring it. I'd like to move in and talk a little bit about Aesop. Now, Aesop gets a lot of credit. Not a children's author by no means, but Aesop has really become synonymous in I guess in our culture, especially in the West, with the fable. So if you hear the word fable, the first thing that pops into our minds is Aesop. Now, likely there was never a guy named Aesop. It's probably just what they would call a nom de plume, or a pen name, in other words. So, and I guess historians would place him somewhere 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century, somewhere along in there. And his fables definitely draw attention to politics and society. So, I mean, we use them for children now to teach those good moral lessons, but in their day, children wouldn't have been part of those conversations, and those wouldn't have been the changers of society. So Aesop, or whoever he is, the fables that he's putting together, he's drawing attention of those who can change society. So a fable, I have some notes here, and I have a PowerPoint that I'll place in there along with this video so that you'll be able to go back to them, because much of this information is going to be very valuable to you when we get to the final for the course. Now, a fable is nothing more than a short tale that's going to teach a moral lesson. That's really it in a nutshell. Often, and I think this is why it's so attractive to children, is that we're going to use animals or inanimate objects as characters. Like the fable of the tortoise and the hare. I mean, we do see turtles as being slow, and we do see rabbits as being fast, but they also become symbols for people in the world. We're not all fast. We're not all intellectual. We're not all the same. So we have this difference in people, and there is some perceived seniority in that system, and we'll talk more about that with tension and conflict next week. Um, and it's not necessarily a story that is founded on fact. So for us to take these stories and think that this actually happened and they just placed a rabbit and a turtle together, that's kind of a crazy idea. So that's not even the purpose of the fable. It's the message, it's the moral in it, not so much the characters. Now, that's something that I think we really get wrapped around, especially in the Disney era. We get wrapped around the princesses, we get wrapped around the villains, we get wrapped around all of those things instead of really kind of envisioning what the message and the moral of the story really is. Now, they can be a story that is very supernatural or about extraordinary persons or incidents. They create legends, and there are fables for gods and many of our heroes that fall outside of Aesop's realm. It can also be to expose an untruth or a falsehood. To boast a cure is a medical fable. If we think we can cure anything, it's a medical fable. You know, even if you have a wart on your hand, it's not necessarily true that you can rub and then my grandmother believed this, that you could rub a potato on it and bury it in the yard somewhere and don't tell anybody where you buried it and the wart will go away. She truly believed that. It's not true. It's very much a fable, but that's not important because a myth, a legend, a fable, a fairy tale, any kind of religious narrative is not constrained by the necessity of proof or truth in order for it to be useful in our lives, to set up some moral or ethical standard. So we can even postulate personal manifestos by that. This is the way I'm going to live my life, by this belief that we can never prove as being true and real. So fables just accentuate all of that, is I guess the way to really look at that. Now, these fables do have elements, very much the characterization in these fables. You don't have a whole lot of characters, usually just a couple, and they're interacting together. We may see some in the background, but for the most part, they're just not teaming with all sorts of characters. And they all appear to be very animated. There's a term for that, anthropomorphic. Whenever we take something and give it kind of a human form or an attribute that's very much human, that's anthropomorphic. Because all of our characters, even if they are animals, are very much personified so that they have these true attributes of a human and that they struggle with the human condition just as we do. Now, the setting for a lot of these stories is really ambiguous. It's anywhere and everywhere. Even you'll find in the fairy tales, as we start to work with those next week, that in a kingdom far away, there's no geographical location because it's ambiguous. It doesn't really matter where the place is because it's not the place that's important, it's the message in the story. So sometimes, and most of the time, they're imaginary places. They don't exist, they never did exist. And time is irrelevant too. It's anytime. No time, anytime, tomorrow, today, yesterday. It just doesn't matter because that's not what we're worried about. We're not worried about in a land far away at a time long ago, knowing exactly when that is because that's not what's important. It's about the moral and the message that we can pull from it today. All of them have a plot. Every story has a plot. If it doesn't have a plot, we don't have a story. Then we have a sentence fragment, essentially. So a plot, but they're going to be very simple. Although they're simple, that doesn't mean that they are not interesting. Because of the conflict and the motifs that we see in the stories, they are very thought-provoking. And they are very didactic. So in other words, they're very teachable. Every one of them has a theme. And typically, that theme revolves around some moral or ethical message that society or the politique or the group can really benefit from. Now, the style of these are very, very casual. They're not academic in nature, they're not very intellectual. They are written in a style or even orally told in a style um, casually so that anybody can understand that. And usually they're written in a style to where we have the older person or the elder passing on wisdom to the younger. And I can really kind of see that when I think about like my grandparents and some of the stories that they told me. It was like there was something here that I was supposed to get. So it's this passage of wisdom that happens. Um, all the dialogue, the emotional structure of many of these fables, they have real world accuracy. We still have these issues today. One of my favorite fables is, let me find it here, the swallow, the serpent, and the court of justice. And I just want to share that with you for a minute because I really like it because it is very contemporary. Um, Emotionally, it's very contemporary. And some of you may have even experienced this as I have. And it says, a swallow returning from abroad, and especially fond of dwelling with men, built herself a nest in the wall of a court of justice. And there hatched 7 young birds. A serpent gliding past the nest from its hole in the wall ate up the young unfledged nestlings. The swallow, finding her nest empty, lamented greatly and exclaimed, woe to me, a stranger, that in this place, where all others' rights are protected, I alone should suffer wrong. Very contemporary context, because even in Aesop's day, whoever he is, they were having the same problem down at the courthouse that we do. That those who should receive justice don't always receive justice. And sometimes those that live in that justice house are what should be, they should be the most moral and ethical in our society, typically are snakes. Okay, and so this use of snakes and this kind of this life that he gives us, the anthropomorphic, we understand that from very early on in the Christian and Jewish scripture, and we see it today used the same way. The snakes are kind of slithery and they're sneaky and they're just there to bite you. And so I think that's why I like that one so much. In the places that we should receive justice, we never really do. So, children's literature and what we had for the week to look at, we were also to look at some religious literature. And what I gave you was not necessarily religious literature. What I gave you were a bunch of coloring books. Okay, and I like these for one big reason. It's because these coloring books may have been given to children at a certain church or by parents, and they're given to these children in an effort to kind of bring them into the fold or bring them into this understanding that their parents have of maybe the divine system, a religious system. And these aren't the end of all ends. There are plenty out there, and they run the gamut of mature material. But one that really drew my attention, if you're looking through them, if you go to the one that has to do with Noah and the flood, and something really neat that I pulled out of this, and then I even actually went back and read it in the actual scripture in several different biblical translations, is this page here. So if you're reading this, it says, Noah was a man who worshiped God. Everyone else hated and disobeyed God. One day God said something shocking. I will destroy this world. God told Noah, only your family will be saved. I thought, wow, that's kind of harsh. Okay? And what seemed harsh about it was not so much, because this, kind of is in the scripture, so to speak. But there's a word here that in my exploration of those scriptures was not there. And it's that word hate. Everyone else hated God. Okay? Noah was a man who worshiped God. So if you worship God, you're not hating. So it was such a generalization, and I went back to the scripture, and I even printed it out here so I could share that with you. And this is chapter 6 of Genesis. It says, "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he it also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I've created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and these are the generations, and it goes on and on. This is the King James version. And I read several of them the first time that I had come across this when I was setting up the course a year ago. And it really occurred to me then that much of the literature that we expose to children, we do have motivations. And so that's one of the things that I think that as educators or even as parents, we have to really know where our motivations and really our biases lie. So obviously those who are, publishing this particular piece and parents who are giving the structure, some parents don't even know what their children are back in children's church, what they're really doing back there or what they're being kind of indoctrinated into. So, it really, a parent has to make those decisions and teachers have to make those kinds of decisions, but look for the little things. Is that really, when we're using this as a representation of that particular story, then we find that maybe it's not a good representation. It does say that there were wicked people, and yeah, they were pretty disobedient, but at no point in the real scripture is there this claim that they hated God. So there are these messages that are being conveyed to children with our religious literature, and we could look at all of them, and the pieces I gave you, I had them in there because they all had something that kind of made my eyebrows go like that. And for a guy like me, my bachelor's degree is in religion, I picked those things out fairly quickly. So I just wanted to kind of share those with you because we do use those things, and especially something like Noah's Ark, because it almost feels cute and cuddly, not so much because it's a moral teaching, but it's about the animals, and it becomes about Noah and being such a good man, and the dove that is sent out after 40 days when the rain stops, and those kinds of things that we're sharing with our children. We have to always consider the message that they're getting in anything that we're presenting to them as media, even if it's a movie. We have to be extremely cautious that they get the message that we want. Now, I didn't include any parables, and most of us are fairly, familiar with like the parables of Christ and all those things in the New Testament. But those are not the only parables in the world. Not the end of all end of parables. Lots of cultures, various other religions have parables, which are nothing but stories that are going to teach a lesson or make us more knowledgeable and wise about something. And the last one that I'd like to share with you before I let you go today is a Native American parable. It's from the Sioux, and it goes like this. It says, the Creator gathered all of creation and said, I want to hide something from the humans until they are ready for it. It is the realization that they create their own reality. The eagle said, give it to me. I will take it to the moon. The Creator said, no, one day they will go there and find it. The salmon said, I will bury it on the bottom of the ocean. No, they will go there too. The buffalo said, I will bury it on the great plains. The Creator said, they will cut into the skin of the earth and find it even there. Grandmother Mole, who lives in the breast of Mother Earth and who has no physical eyes but sees with spiritual eyes, said, put it inside of them. And the Creator said, it is done. So the big parable is that we never look inside of ourselves for an answer. We're always digging and prodding and prying somewhere else rather than looking internally for the solution to our problems, or sometimes even looking for the problem itself inside of us. So that's what I have for you this morning. I know it's kind of long and labored, but I just want to make sure that you have a really good foundation for the course. I will add a PowerPoint with all of this for your use. And like I said before, you'll definitely be able to use this on the final. Now, we'll slow down on the videos and try not to bore you too badly. The next one that I post up will have we'll consider the fairy tales and those kinds of things. And the one after that, I have something to do with poetry and children's poetry. So have a great week. Don't forget to get your introductions done if you've not done that. I opened the first major assignment for the course. I hope you watched that video and that you're clear. If you do have any questions on any of this material, a point that you would like to make, there's nothing wrong with you calling, coming by, sending an email, or even if you wanted to make your own video and post it up for the whole class if there's a point that you want to make. I'm perfectly all right with that. You guys have a great week, and I will talk to you later on.